ELI5 Why is the greenhouse effect only one way? So the thing about greenhouse gases is that they are transparent to visible light but opaque to infrared radiation. So light from the sun passes through the atmosphere. The energy is absorbed by things on the planet's surface. Those things then release that energy through blackbody radiation, which will be in the infrared range, which we experience as heat. That radiation ideally reaches space and beyond, cooling the planet. But greenhouse gas is reflected back to the Earth's surface instead. It's exactly like a literal greenhouse, except with gas instead of glass. It's not the light that's reflecting off the Earth and then going back up that's the problem. It's the light that gets absorbed by the Earth making the Earth warm and then released back out that's the problem. When the warm ground released energy back out as a form of light, it's a different color of light than originally hit the Earth and made it warm in the first place. The greenhouse effect is a barrier based on the color of the light, so it lets in the sunlight no problem, but it becomes a barrier to the Earth light. Others made a good point about different types of radiation, which is true and a very important aspect of the greenhouse effect. In addition, it's also not so much a barrier as a filter or a sieve. If you look at it as a sieve, then it isn't really all that weird that it lets in more than it lets out. Let's say 80 passes a sieve and 20 is filtered out. In that case 80 of sunlight comes into the Earth, passing the sieve once. Going out it passes a sieve again and 20 is filtered out again, so only 64 leaves the Earth. When the light comes from the sun, it's mostly visible light that reaches us through the atmosphere. The greenhouse gas doesn't block this type of light, which is why we can see the sun. But when the light hits the ground becomes warm. And warm bodies emit their heat through infrared radiation, which is just like light but is invisible for our eyes. That radiation is then trapped with us on the ground, because the greenhouse gas molecules are absorbing that radiation and radiate away into random directions. The other commenters nailed the explanation, but I'll add that we can do a thing that's like the greenhouse effect in reverse passive daytime radiative cooling. There's a small window of IR 8000-13,000 nanometers that isn't absorbed by the atmosphere. So if you engineer a material that absorbs emits strongly in that range but not others, you can use all of space as a heat sink. Stanford spun it out into a company called SkyCool in 2016. Basically, regular sunlight energy is going from space to Earth, where it's reflected, then back to space. What happens with greenhouse gases, like carbon dioxide, chlorofluorocarbons, nitrous oxides, etc., is the bigger molecules interact with the sun's energy and slow down the transfer back into space. The longer the energy spends in the atmosphere, the more the atmosphere heats up. If the concentration of greenhouse gases get high enough, it basically traps the energy indefinitely. Ask yourself what happens to a car parked in the sun with its windows up? Answer: the interior heats up. Why? Because the car windows let in the sunlight but do not let out the resultant heat that the sunlight converts into when it hits the interior of the car. What happens if the windows are rolled down? Answer: the interior cools down. Why? Because the resultant heat is now able to escape. The Earth's atmosphere acts similarly to the glass windows in a car. How well light transmits through a material depends on the wavelength of light. Light from the sun has a peak intensity in the visible range, which transmits through the atmosphere fairly well. Once that light hits Earth, it is largely absorbed and transformed into heat, which radiates away through longer infrared wavelengths. It is these infrared wavelengths that greenhouse gases absorb, thus trapping the energy. The light and the heat are two different things. The atmosphere is transparent enough for the light to get through because photons simply pass through it mostly. But heat is essentially the energy of molecules in a fluid bouncing, colliding and generally moving. So for heat to leave the system, all that energy has to make its way out of the outer atmosphere. This is why that is more difficult. It comes in as light and should go out as infrared heat. When you light something for long enough it becomes hotter. And this energy can also be sent out as infrared light that we cannot see. Now the CO2 only blocks the infrared. So the light goes through, warms up the Earth, and Earth is unable to release the heat and gets heated up more and more. Light is frequency when coming in, hitting the Earth and warming it. Earth then emits light with much lower frequency. The one with the higher moves through greenhouse gases when coming in. The one with the lower gets trapped in. Light got all the motivation and focus when coming in, and when going out it does not. Like in a swamp, the light from the sun that heats the Earth up, visible light, is different from the light the Earth emits to cool down infrared light. GHGs are opaque to infrared light but not opaque to visible light. They slow down cooling but let the Earth heat up at the same rate. Infrared radiation is a form of radiation created by the Earth in a reaction to receiving radiation from the Sun, and it is this radiation which is reflected back to the surface of the Earth, causing the rise in temperature. The difference is in the wavelength. CO2 and other greenhouse gases block infrared light, heat, but not so much visible light. Unlike Sun, Earth doesn't radiate visible light, only infrared light. It's not letting heat in, only visible light mostly. That gets converted into infrared light heat by the ground, which cannot pass back through the greenhouse gases because of their properties. To add to others' good answers, we can do the opposite with materials designed to emit wavelengths transparent to our atmosphere. Here is a cool video on making it. Comes in as visible light which passes through the atmosphere no problem, and then is radiated out as infrared which doesn't travel through the atmosphere as well. Oversimplification. Light comes in and heats things up. Radiation. Heat can't get back out because the greenhouse gases act as a blanket between a warm Earth's surface and cold space. Follow-up. ELI5. Why can't we open the atmosphere and vent some of this heat out? I know holes in the ozone are bad, but would it let the heat out? It's like a car sitting in the sunshine all day with the windows rolled up. The windows let the sunlight in but don't let the heat out. It's like in a car. When light goes through the glass, heats up the surface inside, but the glass is airtight so the heat can't escape. Thanks for the responses everyone! I had not considered that the light gets transformed after it reaches Earth.